Welcome back to another episode of Your Hope-Filled Perspective. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and it's always our goal to restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in your God-given identity. I am enjoying this series that we've entitled the Sacred Scar Story series because we all have those wounds that, when placed in the hand of our good and redemptive God, will bring forth beautiful sacred scars, but it doesn't mean that we don't have to go through the yuck and the mire. And so all of my guests have a unique and individual story that I'm hoping that within the story, you can find part of your experience to relate to. My guest today is no stranger to your hope-filled perspective. She's been on the podcast numerous times, and she was one of the first people that I thought of who truly has a sacred scar story. It's Jill Savage, who's an author, speaker, marriage coach, and hope of the No More Perfect podcast. That's your sermon right there. No more perfect. Perfect doesn't live here. Jill and her husband, Mark, have come through the fire of Mark's infidelity, but now they have a deeper, richer, stronger marriage and are living out the mission to help other marriages. The Savages live in a place called Normal, Illinois, where they love on their 5 kids and 6 grandkids. I'd like to know what normal is like. Welcome back to the podcast, Jill, because I'm like, what is it exactly?
Oh, I think it was Patsy Claremont that said like normal is just a setting on your dryer, or in our case, it happens to be your address. But we know all the jokes. Our kids went to normal schools. We go to a normal church. But honestly, I think our ministry is formed around helping people deal with the normal stuff of life. And the normal stuff of life, honestly, is the stuff that I mean, it is the mundane every day, but it's also the stuff that you're talking about in this series that leaves us with these sacred scars. As much as we don't want to label that as normal, it is. It's a part of the human experience on this side of heaven.
And none of us would choose to go through any of these things, but Jesus told us in this life you will experience trouble. But what
Yeah.
I have seen to be true in the lives of so many that I've interviewed here, as well as in my private practice, and especially true for you and Mark, is that sometimes our areas of greatest pain and wounding end up being our greatest area of ministry. So take our listeners back. If they're not familiar with you, they haven't heard you previously on podcast episodes, which by the way, we will link in the show notes. Share the experience that you went through that brought either physical wounds, spiritual, emotional, relational. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, my husband and I have been in full-time ministry really all of our married life. He went to Bible college several years after we got married, and then he served as a pastor on a large church staff for 10 years, and then we church planted for 10 years. The church planting was difficult for us. I feel like that was the beginning of what we now call the slow fades in our marriage. And slow fades are what we would call connection erosion.
Wow.
So it's eroding ever so slowly that we don't really know it. We don't understand it. We talk about that in our No More Perfect Marriages book. We talk about the different kinds of slow fades that marriages experience. And we were experiencing many of those. And so in 2010, my husband was just kind of burnout from ministry. He was not in a good place emotionally. I was leading an international nonprofit ministry for moms called Hearts at Home. And that had always been a bit of a pull in our relationship because I had this huge responsibility outside of the church. And then as a pastor's wife, I had these huge expectations, both from him and from the church, inside of the church. And there was just always, I mean, we were talking about it, we were trying to process it, but it was making things challenging at times. And I would ask my husband, do I need to resign from Hearts at Home? And he would say, absolutely not. Absolutely not. But it was difficult. And so in 2010, he decided to leave ministry. And Mark had dealt with depression off and on throughout our married life. But I started to see him spiral into the deepest, darkest depression I'd ever seen him spiral into. And that lasted for about a year. And it was in mid 2011 that I discovered that he was having an emotional affair. And um, when I brought that to him, he was very minimizing of it and promised that he would stop talking to this person. Happened to be an old girlfriend from high school, so someone who had connected with him on Facebook, and so then eventually, though, it actually went underground and it became a physical affair. And I discovered that in the fall of 2011. That pulled the rug under, out from underneath my life. Like I would have put us on the list of least likely to ever experience that.
But isn't
Uh,
that exactly how the enemy works? Here you were part of a ministry, Hearts at Home, and yet
mhm.
that's exactly where the enemy struck.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. And not only that, but Mark had been a marriage and family life pastor for 10 years before we church planted. And we developed a marriage conference that became very, very popular. And we would do those. We started it through the church, but even after we left the church, we continued to do those marriage conferences for many years. So, yeah, it really, yeah, that's exactly where the enemy goes. And he certainly did. Mark was really disillusioned with life. He was disillusioned with God. He was disillusioned with marriage. And honestly, our marriage it was really kind of a scapegoat for his disillusionment.
Mm.
Um, and so that began an almost 1 year process for me of standing for my marriage. My husband was checked out and he was like, "Yep, I'm having an affair and I am not stopping." And I thought, who am I married to? Like, this was not the person I was married to. And so, um, I found there was actually a word for this, standing for your marriage. I'd never heard that. I didn't even know there was such a thing, but it's when one spouse is checked out, the other one believes for the marriage. And so I just began to intercede by prayer, believing that if Mark would return to his God, he would return to his marriage. It got worse before it got better. So he eventually left and just, I mean, completely uprooted our 5 kids' lives, our grandkids' lives. Um, it was uh, it was the most painful thing I've experienced, and I've experienced some painful things. I've ultimately experienced the loss of that ministry that I ran for 24 years. The doors were shut shortly after I resigned as the CEO. I've experienced breast cancer and all of the treatments for that. But I will say, of all of that, the most painful thing I've ever experienced is my husband's betrayal. It was the deepest wound
Yes.
that I've ever experienced.
And in what way, when you can look back now with hindsight vision, in what way did that wound hold you back, cause shame or fear, or even limit you walking in freedom in Christ?
Well, of course, here I was, someone who had taught about marriage and who had this entire ministry that focused on relationships. And so immediately, of course, the enemy wants to accuse. That's what he is. He's the accuser. And so he, immediately it was, um, it was the shame of that.
Mhm.
I remember after Mark left, I was determined that I was going to be honest about this publicly to, you know, with limits. I had a ministry based upon authenticity.
Yeah.
So I was determined to be authentic, but I also didn't want to put too much out there because I also wanted my husband to return home.
Yeah.
And so I remember I gathered my um my board of directors, my best friend, and my pastor. And I said, I need wisdom, and I need to know how to talk about this publicly without compromising the possibility of my husband to come home. And so we talked through that. But I can remember that day, Michelle, as you talk about shame and wounds and all of that, I broke down and I said to them, am I the horrible person that my husband says that I am? Because even though I knew that Mark was really just lashing out because he was in pain himself, and I was the scapegoat for that pain. Our marriage was, but yet at the same time, there were things I needed to look at in our life. Like what I now say when we teach on marriages, I will say, I I did not cause my husband's infidelity, but I did contribute to the dysfunction in our marriage. And I had to be responsible for that. So I was willing to do that. But boy, the enemy was just accusing. And I can remember that day just breaking into tears, going, if I am, you need to tell me. Like you all are my people and you need to speak honestly with me. And of course they loved me well. And they said, Jill, no, no, there is you, you cannot take the lashing out and the way in which he is cutting at your heart. You have to look at the big picture. And so I was grateful for that. But man, that was probably, especially after he left, and then I had to talk about that. And that was difficult. I feel like that was where the enemy really came in and accused, and there was quite a bit of time there where I I would go to bed just so I could pretend like the world didn't exist. It was really dark.
But you going to the board and your best friend and your pastor shows the importance of having community around you who will speak truth in love.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's what
And
iron sharpens iron.
and Michelle, it's really important that we build that in times outside of
Yes.
tragedy, because when we're in that, we don't have the energy for it. And so I was so grateful that I did have those people in my life and that they did love me, so that because I didn't have any energy to try to find the wagons. I already had the wagons. I just needed to circle the wagons.
Since that time, how has God healed the wound, formed a sacred scar, and used this for good?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, in the beginning, what God did is, I was standing for my marriage, but my husband was giving me no indication that he would ever make a U-turn. I was believing for it because I believed that restoration was possible, that hope was possible, with God, all things are possible. So I was believing that, but my husband was showing no evidence of that. In fact, if anything, he was showing evidence of being further and further and further and further away. But initially, um, I began to recognize that, and if you'll pardon my French, that this was a really crappy season in my life, but I could use that crap as fertilizer for growth.
Mhm.
And that's what I decided to do. And I began to dig in to um, the growth that I needed to make, the ways that I needed to look at what I had brought to the marriage in a dysfunctional way, the places that God wanted me to grow. And one of the things I learned about myself is I learned that I had an avoidant attachment. And what that means is that I tended to operate in a buck up way. So I would just avoid emotions, I would stuff emotions. But what that had done is it had sent an unintentional message to my husband that I did not need him. I didn't know that. So I began to dig into these areas that I needed to grow in, and I began to use that. So that would be the first way that God began to redeem this dark season. Was like, I remember saying to myself and praying, Lord, I don't know if my marriage will make it or not, but I know that I have some growing to do, and I'm going to use this dark season as fertilizer for growth. So that would be the first way. The second is that as I made those changes, my husband actually began to see them as a seed of hope, because the other relationship had gone on long enough that it was now having conflict. And he was waking up and he was going, oh, wait a minute, maybe this really isn't the answer. And it was kind of waking him up to the very things he knew, but boy, the enemy had blinded him during this dark season. And so eventually on Easter Sunday of 2012, he had what we call his own personal resurrection, where he literally made a U-turn. It was like he got to the end of himself and he surrendered. And he said, no, not my will, yours, Lord, only yours. I will do whatever you ask me to do. And we began to rebuild our marriage at that point. And it took us about 18 months of weekly marriage counseling to fully put the wheels back on the bus, to heal the hurt, for both of us to restore trust with each other. Oftentimes when there's infidelity, it's like the finger is primarily pointed at the person that was unfaithful. But I broke my husband's trust with my avoidance. I broke my husband's trust with my critical spirit. I had to rebuild that. And he had to certainly rebuild trust as it related to his faithfulness in our marriage. And so we began, that healing process. And I think it was about 3 years after we had completed our healing, we had the opportunity to share our story for the first time. And we decided to do that on our blog. We felt like we were far enough away from the pain that, hey, it would probably be helpful to share our story. And so we did it in a 10-day blog series. And Michelle, my blog readership went from 5,000 to 15,000 overnight. And it was like, whoa, what just happened? And we realized that was the moment we realized, oh, we have this sacred scar that God can now use for his good. He can turn our pain into his purposes. And so we eventually wrote our book, No More Perfect Marriages. We then eventually wrote 2 more books on infidelity recovery. One is called My Heart is Broken, and the other one is called I Really Messed Up. And then ultimately, about 6 years ago, God opened the door for us to start marriage coaching. And that initially, we did that kind of on the side of our day job. And here we are almost 7 years later, and we do it full time. And we absolutely love what we do. So we do our marriage coaching. We do marriage intensives, which is a 3-day intensive where we work with one couple at a time. And we have certainly seen God use our sacred scar for his good.
The thing about sacred scars is that none of us ever want to go through the wound that ends up producing that beautiful sacred scar. And I so appreciate that you mentioned that what really turned Mark's heart back towards your marriage was coming to the end of himself. And so often I think that's what our areas of wound do. We get to that place where I got nothing. And the only
Yeah.
place we can look is up to God, who can restore and redeem the ugliest parts. And in this series, I've interviewed folks who have talked about things happening to them that have wounded them. But we also have to look at the fact that sometimes we participate in
Hmm.
that which brings about our greatest area of wound. But there is forgiveness in the
Yeah.
God of creation who sent his son to die so that we could be forgiven.
Yes, absolutely. And it was funny because my husband now will tell the story that for the longest time he was just constantly asking God for forgiveness. And then one day God spoke to his heart and said, Mark, I forgave you the first time you asked. When are you going to forgive yourself? And Mark says that day he literally, like figuratively in his head, pulled the A off of his chest for adulterer and slapped an R on his chest for redeemed.
Beautiful.
Isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And that is, God's in the restoration business. He's in the redeeming business. That's what he does best, is to take those broken places and then to be able to turn them into something beautiful. And we have certainly seen that in our lives, as well as in the lives of those that we've had the privilege of walking alongside. And as they've recovered from maybe not infidelity, but other forms of hurt or broken trust in their marriage. And it's been a joy to really have a front row seat at watching God work.
And the growth in your blog overnight from 5,000 to 15,000, it is just a glimpse at how much heartache exists in marriages out there. Marriage is not easy. The best
Nope.
of marriages go through the most difficult times. So, Jill, if a listener is listening to our conversation today, maybe they're resonating because they're struggling in their marriage. Either they've caused it, the other person has caused it, or more realistically, both have contributed in some way
Mhm.
because it's rarely one person. What hope-filled perspective would you want to leave them with today?
Nothing is impossible with God. Nothing. And even if, it certainly takes two to restore a marriage. But it only takes one to restore a life. And so, regardless of whether, you're in a difficult setting with your marriage, I walk alongside a lot of women who are in difficult marriage situations, and we're praying for that restoration. But they can experience that restoration in their life, even if their spouse never makes that U-turn. And so, that would be, there's hope and help. And the God of second chances wants to do his best work through the cracks in your life.
It sure does. And your example, even while Mark didn't look like there was any chance that he was going to come back home, your example of basically saying, Lord, change me, is so similar to, I think it was Elizabeth George who wrote the book, Lord, Change Me. We
Mm.
have a tendency as fallible humans to want to say, God, change him.
Oh,
But
totally.
sometimes God does his greatest work when we leave the other person, whether it's a spouse or it's a friend or it's a boss or a coworker or whoever, when we leave that other person up to God and say, but Lord, what's within me that needs to be changed, that needs to be unearthed, that needs to be plowed and tilled and harvested? And he will. He will honor that prayer, even if the other person never changes.
Yeah. I remember the day that God spoke to me about that, Michelle. I was reading God's word and I was reading Matthew 7, and that's where it says, why do you try to take the speck out of And that day, as I read it, it said, your husband's eye, when there is a plank in your own eye, you hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will be able to help remove the speck out of your husband's eye. Now, there isn't a
Ouch.
Bible out there. There isn't a Bible out there that has the translation that says husband.
Right,
Okay. But
right.
I'm telling you, that day God came down, changed the words on the page. That's how I read it. And he took the plank that was in my own eye and just hit me over the head with it.
Mhm.
And I needed to do that because I was doing the finger pointing. My husband came from a really dysfunctional home and family. And one of the things that would happen when we were in counseling is just how much baggage he had. And so, honestly, I mean, that was another area I had to look at. Is it fueled pride in me? Like, okay, look, I have 6 suitcases and you have 6 semis of suitcases. And that was part of what was causing the dysfunction in the marriage. So I had to be willing to look at that and to go, yeah, it's time for me to look at my 6 suitcases. I didn't come with as much baggage as he did, but I had probably an equal amount of sin that he did, and I needed to look at that.
Well, isn't it true that all have fallen short of the glory of God? So we all
Yeah.
have areas, not only that we need to work on, but that God longs to redeem and restore. Jill,
Yes.
thank you for your ministry, but thank you more for your honesty and vulnerability, because the kind of experience that you went through is akin to so many of my listeners that feel the shame and they don't want anyone to know. So thank you for sharing so that we can see that those things that are kept in the dark hold their power. But when we bring them out into God's light, He can restore and redeem, and He can and longs to bring beautiful sacred scars out of your greatest area of wounds and pain.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jill, if people are interested in finding out more about you, your ministry, your books, your intensives, where's the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, they can find us at markandjill.org, just markandjill.org. And we do have a free, for anybody that's walking through a difficult situation, we have a free rebuilding trust guide. And people are welcome to tap into that. And that can be found at rebuildingtrust.us, rebuildingtrust.us.
I love that. Friends, we will put all the information about Mark and Jill and their ministry in the show notes that you can find at drmichelleb.com. Friends, you may not be going through a marital crisis, but we all go through relationship pain at some point. None of us are perfect and we all contribute. So I hope that even if yours is not a story of marital infidelity, that you could relate to the hope and encouragement that Jill has shared today. I'm enjoying this series and I hope you are too. If something in this series is encouraging your heart, consider sharing it with a friend who needs hope, encouragement in their place of greatest wound as well. Until we meet again next week, I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and it's my prayer for you that you have a hope-filled week.